Greetings, this is MBA 522, Decision Making in Organizations, and the lecture material that we'll be covering in this little lecture is about persuasion, specifically how influence and power in politics enable us to persuade others. Persuasion is particularly important in the context of decision making because we need to be able to persuade others if we are working within a group and we believe a decision needs to be made in a certain way. So one of the key aspects of decision making, particularly in a group, is to work with others, to collaborate with others, but also oftentimes to persuade others. Now, sometimes we're persuading others who are at our peer level, right? So it's one peer trying to persuade another peer who are working as peers on a group or a team. But sometimes you are going to be asked to provide a recommendation to your senior executive in a C-suite executive in your company, and you're going to ask them and make recommendations for them to behave in a particular way because you've been empowered to make recommendations on a particular decision. So the extent to which you can persuade others to do what you believe is the right decision to make is really important. So then we have to figure out where power and how power influences that whole process, the different tactics you can use to influence others, as well as how organizational politics can influence that and what impact that has on decision making. So influence is the way we get people to follow our advice and our suggestions, or even the orders that we give. Remember that people are the only resource that even if you order them to do something, they have a mind of their own and may not reply and respond the way you want them to. So the most important thing to recognize is that when you are working with others, you have to influence them to behave in the way that you want them to. Now, there are times when you're going to have to make an order to someone, and you may have the power to be able to do that, and you have the consequences that you have to deal with in terms of punishment if someone does not follow through on those orders. But that doesn't mean we go to the order to others right away. Sometimes all we have to do is ask or make a suggestion or ask their advice in order to be able to get things done the way we want them to. But we have to recognize that each individual is motivated very differently and requires a different set of tools to get them to comply or to engage in the behaviors that we want them to engage in. So let's talk about the three potential outcomes when we're influencing somebody. Number one, you can get absolute commitment from someone. And so basically you say, hey, can you do this? And you're like, you know, that's a great idea. Of course I'm going to do this. I buy into it and I'm happy to do it. And that's the goal. That's what we aspire to, right? We want someone to say, I agree with you. I'm going to do this. I'm committed to it. And that's how I want to handle it. Alternatively, you've got compliance. And with compliance, what you're getting is someone that says, I'll do it, but I don't agree with this. And the thing is with compliance, sometimes that's the best we can hope for, particularly if we know someone is absolutely against the idea, but they recognize that sometimes you have to do something you don't really like to do, and compliance is where we're at. The challenge that I think you will have is if you have a workforce full of people who are simply complying and they don't necessarily buy into the ideas and things like that. So compliance is something we absolutely will use minimally and recognize that sometimes compliance is all that we're going to get out of people. But if that is the aspiration, if we only hope for compliance and don't hope for commitment, this is going to be problematic for us as we try to manage our organization and manage those for whom we're responsible. So the aspiration is for commitment. It requires us to do more, to influence more, to have an impact, to negotiate, to recognize that we have to have conversations and have transparency with others in order to get that commitment. But there are going to be times with certain types of people where the best you can hope for is compliance, And that's okay. Like as I said, we just don't want to make that the only thing we aspire to. Lastly, we're going to end up with resistance. There's always someone that is going to resist. And as the saying goes, people are okay with change as long as you don't change them. So people don't like to be changed, but they're okay if change goes on around them. So oftentimes when we're trying to influence someone to do something, it's because we're changing the way that they do work, or we're changing what impact their work has in the organization, what role it plays, how central it is to the flow of work. And so that resistance may come because they're scared, because they don't like change. Other times we have people who resist simply because they just like to resist. They are naysayers. They pride themselves in being the person who says no all the time. And so that's our goal, is to be able to work with others to make sure we get commitment or compliance. In relationship to power and politics, influence absolutely is directly related to how much power you have and the politics involved within the organization specifically. Let's start with power first. Power is the capacity to influence the behaviors of others. In essence, your power comes from you as a person based on your ideas, your influence, your knowledge, how much you're respected by others. And politics is when it basically takes, doing work in the organization to only serve yourself and not serve others or the organization. And so politics can be influenced by factors that are going on in the organization and also personal characteristics. If someone is really Machiavellian, they may, and I don't mean that as, being Machiavellian is not necessarily a bad thing, but they may be much more interested in doing for themselves and managing and manipulating people to achieve whatever it is that they want for themselves, not necessarily in the service of others or in the service of the organization. So you sort of at the end, you're like, it doesn't matter, I won, right? Or it doesn't matter, as long as I got what I wanted, then that's all that mattered. And you may have hurt people, in the wake behind you. There's only so many times you can engage in those behaviors before people start to kick back and refuse to cooperate with you. And so again, this is where the politics start to get pretty dirty. And I think about politics as sort of reality TV on steroids. If you think about Survivor or Big Brother or all of those TV shows where people have coalitions and it seems like they're doing things to help their group, but in the end, they're really just serving themselves. They're making agreements and coalitions, but in the end, they're out to win it, no matter what, regardless of how other people are treated or how other people interact with them. So politics, sometimes politicking is good, where we are sort of negotiating, we're doing a dance, we're trying to influence people, but politics on steroids is a problem for all organizations because it starts to push people against each other. People end up fighting rather than cooperating. And you end up much more so with compliance, not commitment. So politics is really, it's just a black hole for a lot of bad behaviors. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who do it really well. But fundamentally, if you really want to have an organization that's successful, and as we start to think about corporate social responsibility and our role in making sure all of our stakeholders are happy, or at least their needs are being addressed. They may not be happy. Our goal is not to make them happy, but certainly it's to make sure we're meeting their needs. The role of politics can be really detrimental to the organization. The figure in this slide shows you how all these things are really related to each other. We have certain personal characteristics or positions in the organization that influence our ability to have power. And our next slide is going to get into where do the elements of power come from for individuals. But just sort of work with me on this, understanding that there are certain personal characteristics that give people more power than others. There are also organizational level types of positions or attributes that give some people more power than others. And it is power that enables us to influence others. Sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. The more power we have, hopefully the more successful we will be in influencing others, having the desired effect that we want in the outcome. But that doesn't always happen. When we are legitimately looking to serve the organization's goals, that's legitimate. That's legitimate behavior, and that is a great modifier. So power, when used well, when used to serve the organization's goals, is more likely to result in successful outcomes and not unsuccessful outcomes. When your motive in exerting your power is simply to satisfy your own self-interests, your own ego, your own narcissistic behaviors. This is political behaviors in organizational politics. More likely than not, you may be successful, but you'll never get the commitment that you want from people. You'll get compliance because people don't want to lose their job. They don't want to be without a paycheck. But if caught, if managed well, if the organization manages it well, politics and self-motive in terms of satisfying your own interests will hopefully end up in unsuccessful influence. And again, we have to have a culture of an organization that recognizes when someone is behaving in such a way as to meet their own needs versus the needs of the organization. And when we can set up checks and balances to ensure that people are working towards achieving the goals of the company and not their own personal interests, we'll be more likely to see a more positive culture when it comes to influence and power and more successful ability to influence others. So moving into this discussion of power, as you remember I said in the last couple slides, we have power based on where we are in the organizational hierarchy. We call that position power. So the power is actually embedded in your title or where you are in the corporate hierarchy at the top, the bottom, etc. Then we have personal power, which is power that comes from you and your characteristics and who you are as a person. So let's take a couple minutes to talk about position power. People with high levels of position power typically have what we call legitimate power. They have authority that is inherent, embedded in the position that they have, their job title, and it gives them the ability to order people to do things. If you've ever worked with, a high-level CEO, they pretty much can say, please jump, please do this, and people will do it. So having legitimate power means that the power comes from the job that you're doing. It's inherent in that, and it doesn't matter who's in that job. Whoever is in that job has that legitimate power, that legitimate authority. Reward power comes from the ability to reward others. If you have the power to put the carrot out at the end of the stick and encourage someone to do something by rewarding them, you have reward power, absolutely. Then we have coercive power. Oftentimes goes hand in hand with reward power. If you have reward power hand in hand with coercive power, it means you have the power to reward someone, but you also have the power to punish someone. And so if you have the ability to mete out discipline or punishments towards others, you have position power. Many times, though, legitimate power, reward power, coercive power, they all work hand in hand. There are different types of power, but in essence, most positions, particularly people who are higher up in an organization, have the ability to reward people or to punish people, and their title, by definition, has power in it because the title itself means that that person is important. A CIO means they have legitimate power over all information technology issues in the company. They have legitimate power around that. And on top of that, they can reward or punish people as they need to. Information power is the power that the supervisor has to provide their subordinates with information. And so when your supervisor has the freedom to be able to share information with their subordinates, that is information power. And again, that's typically embedded in position power. Where you are in the hierarchy sets up how much power you have in terms of being able to share certain pieces of information. Personal power is getting at characteristics that you have separate from the job title that you have. Your personal power is your ability to rationally persuade others, or to have more knowledge about a particular topic, having referent power because people like you and they respect you. And that respect may come from the fact that you are really smart and you have expert power that way, but fundamentally, referent power oftentimes comes because people just like you. And if they like you, they're more likely to listen to you, they're more likely to be persuaded by you because they like who you are fundamentally. Charisma is also another part of personal power. Charisma is having enthusiasm and optimism that is sort of transformational and encourages others to behave in the same way. Now, charisma, as you know, can be a very bad thing because charismatic leaders aren't always good leaders. They oftentimes, I mean, they're effective leaders, but they're not always good people. So a charismatic leader could be someone like Hitler. Hitler is a charismatic leader. He got a lot of people excited about what he had to do. He got people behind him in terms of being able to motivate them to behave in a particular way. His charisma, his enthusiasm for his agenda, it found that people were able to buy into it. So he had charisma. He also had legitimate power. So it's also incredibly hard sometimes to differentiate between how much of his work was successful because of his charisma, and a lot was, particularly amongst the general public, but also he had legitimate power. So he could order his followers who worked in his organization, who worked in the government, to do his bidding because he had legitimate power. So leaders have the ability to leverage their position power, but they leverage also their personal power at the same time to be able to influence people the way that they want to. So the more power you have, the more you're able to exert influence on others. And sometimes it's a non-negotiable influence because you have reward and punishment power. And sometimes it is you can appeal to other people because you're a nice person and they like you and they're willing to go out of their way to help you. So recognizing those differences is important.